Hey folks, tonight we're diving into one of the most complex, disciplined, and downright grand civilizations in world history, feudal China, for over 2,000 years. It set the bar for science, philosophy, war, art, and bureaucracy. But hold your horses before you start romanticizing. Sure, the Forbidden City looks epic from a distance, but if you actually lived there, your life was anything but glamorous. So before you get cozy, take a sec to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what I'm doing here. And drop a comment telling me which channel you're tuning in from and what time suits you best. It's always fun to see folks joining from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's enjoy tonight's journey together. Welcome to feudal China, where the moment you pop out of your mom, society politely hands you a scroll and seals it tight. Picture the social system as a multi-layered cake, except you're stuck as the crusty bottom layer and the frosting never drips down. At the top sits the Emperor, aka the Son of Heaven, a lovely title until you realize heaven doesn't take complaints. He rules by divine mandate, meaning as long as the harvests are good and rebellion's quiet, his godly status isn't questioned. If things go south, well, apparently heaven changed its mind. Time for a new dynasty. Below him are the scholar officials, folks who spent most of their lives memorizing Confucian texts, spouting philosophy nobody asked for, and developing a permanent hunch from endless scroll reading. But hey, high social status. They passed the Imperial exams. Basically, the SAT on steroids fail, and you're doomed to live in poverty forever. Next up, the peasants. Yep, the muddy, sunburned, starving backbone of society. Confucianism actually admired them. After all, they fed the empire. Unfortunately, respect didn't come with dental care or lunch breaks. Then there were the craftsmen, the people who made stuff with their own hands, paper, porcelain, fans, disappointment, usefulness, take your pick, respected, but not much. But hey, at least they weren't merchants. Oh, the merchants, richer than everyone else, trusted by absolutely no one. According to Confucian values, profiting off other people's work was a big no-no, so you could be decked out in silk and silver, but you'd still get treated like a tax-evading panda in a brocade robe. Then we hit the social basement soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, and criminals. Basically anyone you wouldn't want sitting next to you at a fancy banquet. Oh, and monks too, hanging out somewhere in the gray area between saintly and the reason you're bald and barefoot in public. And finally, women, not even on the social pyramid, more like the pebbles around it, born to obey their fathers, then passed down to obey their husbands and hope to produce sons who can obey even more men. So, if you were born in feudal China with dreams, society's only answer was cute. Now back to work. Your day in feudal China started really early, not because you're a morning person, but because roosters crowed and village bells clanged like they were trying to call the afterlife. You open your eyes, stretch, then instantly remember you're basically not allowed to exist. First, you don't bow to some abstract god or high ideal, but to your dad, then your mom, your granddad, maybe your aunt if she's still kicking. This is filial piety, and it's not just encouraged, it's mandatory. Forget to bow, not rude. No, it brings shame on 7 generations of your family tree. And you don't just bow once. You bow at every stage. You bow when you wake up. Bow before you eat. Bow when an elder coughs your way. The answer, absolutely adorable. Now, back to work. Your day in feudal China starts early, not because you're a morning person, but because roosters crow and village bells clang like they're desperately calling from the other side. You open your eyes, stretch your limbs, and instantly remember you're not really allowed to exist. First, you don't bow to some abstract god or lofty ideal, but to your dad, then your mom, then your grandfather, maybe your aunt if she's still kicking. That's filial piety for you. And it's not just encouraged, it's mandatory. Forget bowing, not rude. No, that's shame on your entire lineage for 7 generations. And you don't bow just once. You bow in stages. You bow when you wake up. You bow before eating. You bow when an elder coughs in your direction. If you don't bow at least 6 times before breakfast, are you even Chinese? Now, suppose you accidentally say the wrong thing during morning tea. Maybe you asked, "Why do I have to wash Uncle's feet?" Well, congrats. You just committed filial impiety. That's only slightly less embarrassing than torching the village square in broad daylight. Better start practicing your apologies, kneel on 3 legs of the ox tower, and bury your face in the floor. And yes, even the furniture is judging you. Most households have no chairs unless they're loaded, so you're basically bowing to wooden stools too. Losing face in society. Best start practicing apologies by kneeling on 3 legs atop the ox tower and bowing your head to the floor. And, yep, even the furniture is judging you. Most households didn't have chairs unless they were rich, so you're kneeling on woven mats. Trying not to collapse while the older folks launch into a 45-minute solo about respect, discipline, and how the world's gone downhill since the last dynasty. Let's not forget, Confucius's hierarchy chart a spiritual PowerPoint, deciding who gets to talk, sit, or even breathe first. Age beats youth. Men outrank women. Fathers outrank everyone, even among siblings. Older ones can steamroll you if you're the youngest. Just nod, smile, and pray you're not blamed for something someone else did. No good mornings in feudal China, just a series of respect rituals and a silent prayer that you don't accidentally offend someone and get disowned today. By 7 a.m., you've bowed about 47 times. Congrats! You survived the opening ceremony. Now it's breakfast, the most important meal of the day, to remind you that life is suffering. So what's on the menu? Let's see. A hot bowl of rice, aka kanji, a fancy way of saying hot, wet, and basically nothing. It's made by boiling rice in water until it puffs up into soup. If you're lucky, there's a pinch of salt. If you're super lucky, a bit of pickled veggies drifts by like a rare koi fish. If your family's poor, honestly, so are you. That bowl of mush is about as exciting as your social prospects. You eat it quietly, respectfully, under the silent judgment of at least one elder who remembers when even daughters were a luxury. Meet. Don't ask. That's saved for festivals, weddings, and royal officials who haven't stepped foot in the rice fields since the Han Dynasty. Eggs are possible, but usually preserved in salt or ash until they look like fossilized sadness. If someone brings out pork belly, you better check if it's a family visit or divine intervention. Of course, tea is served not for chill vibes, but because the water sucks. At least the tea's boiled. So statistically, it's less likely to kill you. You sip a tiny bit while your stomach wonders when the real meal starts. Meanwhile, you eat in silence. Meals aren't for chit-chat. You don't discuss dreams, goals, or last night's tears over the entrance exam. You eat facing the ancestor altar, silently grateful to your forebears, even if they left you a thatched roof, chronic anemia, and impossible family expectations. Bowls are rough pottery, spoons are wooden, no napkins. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve if it's clean enough, and get ready to start consuming the leftovers of your last bite. When you stand up, your dad nods once. Eat fast. Heaven favors the diligent, which roughly translates to get back to work. We've got a whole dynasty to maintain. You've finished your existential porridge. Now it's time to get dressed, not to impress, but to avoid punishment, beatings, or being mistaken for a higher social class, because in feudal China, your clothes weren't about self-expression, but survival. Let's start with fabric hierarchy. You a farmer hemp, rough, itchy, annoying hemp. Medieval fashion was basically wearing a potato sack soaked in disappointment. You a noble silk, shiny, luxurious silk, soft as poetry and whispering taxes to farmers. And guess what if you're caught wearing the wrong fabric? You're not just out of style, you're committing a crime. Clothing wasn't about comfort, it was law. The government had detailed rules about sleeve width, hat styles, belt jewelry, and even colors. For example, yellow was reserved for the emperor alone. Wear yellow as a commoner. And you're not starting a fashion trend. You're executing yourself. Let's talk shoes. Cloth shoes for farmers, embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practical, existential porridge time. Now it's time to get dressed, not to impress, but to avoid punishment, beatings, or worse, being mistaken for a higher social class. Because in feudal China, your clothes aren't about self-expression, they're about survival. Let's start with fabric hierarchy. Peasant. You get rough hemp, rough, itchy hemp that's basically medieval potato sack fashion, soaked in disappointment. Noble silk, gorgeous, soft silk that whispers sweet nothings and taxes peasants more. And guess what? Wear the wrong fabric, and you're not just unfashionable, you're committing a crime. Clothing isn't comfort, it's law. The government has strict rules on sleeve width, hat shape, belt bling, even color. For example, yellow is emperor only. Wear yellow as a commoner, and you're not starting a fashion trend. You're sentencing yourself to death. Let's talk shoes. Cloth shoes for peasants, embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practical, comfy nope. You don't dress for the weather, you dress for the dynasty. Now, feet. Specifically, foot binding, basically turning your toes into a rolled up secret. If you're a noble girl, your feet get broken, folded, and tightly bound starting at age 5. Why? Because we're a noble girl. Your feet would be broken, bent, and tightly bound starting at age 5. Why? Because tiny, deformed feet called lotus feet were considered beautiful. A woman's worth was literally measured by her ability to limp across a room without face planting. It wasn't just painful, it was forever. Foot binding crippled generations of women, turning walking into a painful, delicate art form. But hey, at least you got to wear embroidered shoes no one ever saw, since going anywhere wasn't really an option anymore. Even the men didn't escape wardrobe torture. Officials wore thick, layered robes all year round, even in summer, because status always trumped sweat. Some outfits even had winged hats designed to stop courtiers from whispering in the royal court. So yeah, Chinese royal fashion was elegant, symbolic, and political as heck, but it also scratched, squeezed, overheated, or straight up broke bones. They say beauty is pain. Here, pain was mandatory, and beauty was government-approved dress code. Now you're rocking your socially acceptable potato fiber robe. Fantastic. Time to burn some calories, assuming the land, weather, and taxes don't kill you first. Honestly, in feudal China, work wasn't a calling. It was an endurance test designed by Confucius and enforced by people who never even touched a shovel. If you were a farmer, and statistics say you probably were, you'd spend your life bent over a field, not in some poetic, cinematic way. No, this was hard, back-breaking labor. You'd wake before dawn, plant seeds knee-deep in mud, shoo away mosquitoes as big as tiny birds, and pray the landlord doesn't hike grain taxes again this year. Rain or shine, you worked, drought work harder. Locusts cry and work. Tools were simple. If lucky, you had a wooden plow. If not, just your bare hands. Your ox was your best friend and your retirement plan. Lose that, and you're stuck with 10 miserable acres. Now, suppose you were a woman. Your workload only multiplied. You'd help in the fields, cook, clean, spin threads, weave cloth, raise kids, and somehow still get blamed when dinner was late or your husband sneezed the wrong way. Rest, that's what noble ladies did while debating poetry. Craftsmen weren't much better. You'd spend hours making pottery, paper, or handmade goods, then sell them for just enough to buy some smelly tofu. Merchants technically had more money, but were socially scorned. You could buy half a village and still be treated like a moral failure. Then there was corvée labor, the government's mandatory work duty. One day, the emperor might need a road, a canal, or a tomb. Guess who's building it? For free. Smiling and barefoot, you refuse, and you're branded a criminal, or worse, a rebel. And finally, you drag yourself home, covered in dirt, to a bowl of thin porridge and quiet satisfaction for not dying today. Nowadays, in feudal China, work didn't free you, it just wore you out too much to revolt. Ah yes, The exam system, the grand gateway to advancement, or more accurately, China's eternal written torture chamber. If you were a guy born with a little ambition and a family richer than dirt, your path was clear. Pass the exams, succeed, and you'd become a respected, powerful official in silk robes and a real seat. Fail back to the rice fields. Farmer dude. Simple. Right, not even close. These exams were less multiple choice, more memorizing every word of Confucius and writing poems that'd make a 1,000-year-old ghost weep. Imagine being judged not just on grammar and meaning, but on whether your handwriting flowed like a moral river. One smudge, one wrong character, one too sharp metaphor, and you flunk instantly. Flows like a river of morality. One stain, one wrong character, one too sharp metaphor, and boom's instant failure. Learning starts in early childhood and doesn't stop until puberty hits. Boys cram into freezing huts or boil alive in summer, scribbling essays till their fingers shrivel, turning into claws holding brushes. Teachers drill lessons into your head like academic blacksmiths. Your social life gone. Your hobby is Confucius. Your dream is Confucius. The highest exam, Jinshi, happens in the capital. You're locked in. Your obsession is Confucius. Your dream, also Confucius. The ultimate exam, Jinshi, goes down in the capital. You get locked up in a coffin-sized room with nothing but paper, ink, and anxiety on steroids. You bring your own food, blanket, and chamber pot. Some test takers faint. Others lose their minds. A few straight up die. Yep, death by exam stress is a thing. And guess what? No partial credit for dying. Even if you pass the first round, more exams await county level, province level, national level. Years, even decades might slip by. Some dudes tested well into their 60s. Legend says one guy tried for over 40 years. This isn't just determination, it's trauma with a calligraphy brush. Fail, and society will roast you. Your family, who sacrificed everything for your education, will be heartbroken and sad. Your neighbors will whisper. Mom might cry. Dad will give you that look you know. The why wasn't I born smarter glare? So yeah, this exam can either launch you to the top or wreck your mind, body, and family tree, all for a chance to be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by palace officials. Worth it depends on Confucius. Feeling grimy, yet don't worry. You will, because in feudal China, personal hygiene wasn't a lifestyle. It was a seasonal suggestion. Let's start with the basics. Bathing, occasionally, maybe once every few weeks, if you're lucky and not freezing your butt off. Summer. Sure, you dunk in the rivers. Winter. You might go a whole month without a proper wash. And no lavender-scented soap here. Soap, when used, was animal fat and ash a gritty mix. That sounds like exfoliating through agony. Public baths did exist, especially in big cities. Privacy? Not so much. You'd scrub your armpits next to a grumpy old merchant and a screaming kid while a monk recited hygiene proverbs in the corner. Toothpaste refreshing? Try salt, charcoal, or bone powder. Toothbrushes were animal bristles tied to bamboo sticks. Great if your goal was just to shake up plaque a bit without actually cleaning it. Oral hygiene was terrible, probably why most old folks smiled like haunted lanterns. Then there were parasites, lice, fleas, bedbugs, less pests, more roommates. Rich or poor didn't matter. Got hair, got friends. Comb shops popped up everywhere because everyone needed something to tackle lice. Without one, you'd scratch your scalp like you were trying to summon lightning. Clothes didn't help either. You rocked the same outfit for weeks. Washing meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and praying your clothes didn't catch lice. Underwear existed, but daily use. Not really, especially for peasants who often went commando, risky business. And don't forget toilets, or seriously, do remember them for your own sake. Toilets were usually just holes in the ground, sometimes surrounded by planks if you fancied. Public toilets like haunted wells stinky, crowded, and one step away from a biohazard. Feudal China had silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces, but if you wanted a hot private shower, sorry, you're about 1,500 years too early. So you survived lice, breakfast disappointments, and exam misery. But before you start griping to your neighbors, remember in feudal China, the law was always watching. And unlike modern surveillance, this kind of monitoring came with bamboo sticks and some seriously creative punishments, starting with the legal code. Feudal dynasties, especially during the Tang and Qing, were famous for their detailed, nitpicky laws. There were rules about taxes, hairstyles, hat shapes, proper mourning, and how long you could grieve your in-laws. Accidentally wearing the wrong color on the wrong holiday, technically a crime. Public toilets like haunted wells, stinky, crowded, and always one step away from a biohazard disaster. Feudal China had silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces, but if you want a hot private shower, oh, sorry, you're about 1,500 years too early. So, you survived lice, breakfast disappointments, and exam misery, but before you whined to your neighbors, remember? In feudal China, laws were watched over, not by cameras, but by bamboo sticks and creative punishments. Laws were always watched closely, but unlike modern surveillance, this kind came with bamboo sticks and some truly creative punishments. Let's start with the laws. Feudal dynasties, especially during the Tang and Qing eras, were famous for their nitpicky, over-the-top rule books. There were laws on taxes, hairstyles, hat shapes, proper mourning, etiquette, and even how long you could mourn your in-laws, accidentally wearing the wrong color on the wrong holiday. Technically a crime, and yes, they kept receipts, official records on bamboo slips, stamped and stored by overworked scribes who probably hated their jobs. Punishments, not subtle at all. Forget modern courts and community service. Royal justice was all about teaching lessons through pain. Forget modern courts and community service. Royal justice was all about education through pain. For minor crimes, you might get whacked with a bamboo cane. Fun fact, the court even had different cane sizes. Depending on the crime, insult someone's small stick. Chicken thief, bigger stick. Didn't bow low enough before the height limit. Well, to the judge's horse. Surprise whack incoming. For more serious crimes, things escalate fast. You could get branded with your crime on your face, exiled, or if you really pissed off someone important, slowly executed in public. Torture wasn't an exception, it was just part of the process. If you were accused of something, the court would happily encourage a confession by twisting your thumbs, making you kneel on spiked boards, or holding you in some torture yoga pose for hours while a guy with zero sense of humor screamed at you, waving a scroll. And here's the best part, you didn't even have to be guilty. Just suspicious, inconvenient, or politically unlucky, even your family could be dragged in. The law loved collective punishment. If your cousin said something dumb while drunk, you might wake up to find your whole house under investigation because guilt, obviously, runs in the family. The law was crafted, refined, and downright terrifying. Justice in Imperial China cared less about fairness and more about obedience. The message was clear: behave, respect orders, and whatever you do, don't look the judge's concubine in the eye. Welcome to the royal justice system's favorite pastime, torture. Not punishment, but a handy icebreaker before the trial. Suppose someone accused you of stealing a chicken, being disrespectful to your father, or heaven forbid, voicing a controversial opinion about the emperor's poetry. The judge wouldn't start by hearing your story. Nope. This is Imperial China. You start tied to a bench while they bring out the confession tools. First up, the bamboo stick slapping your back, butt, or thighs until you regret crimes you might not even understand. Not random violence. They kept official punishment logs, counting every lash with bureaucratic precision: 30 for theft, 45 for lying, plus one more for twitching. Still denying it, time to level up. Kneeling on a spiked board is a classic. You kneel on rough wood studded with stones or glass until your legs give out, or so does your will. It's like yoga. If yoga was invented by angry bureaucrats, then there's the finger crusher. 2 wooden boards strapped with rope around your finger. Fun fact, it's called the little tiger chair. Sounds cute until your bones snap like twigs. Hard to confess with broken fingers. But they didn't really care about your handwriting. And yes, this was standard procedure. Torture wasn't morally questionable. It was just the most efficient way to get to the truth. Or at least the truth that matched the official story. Still not confessing, they just dial it up. Some punishments included stretching, whipping, or being tied out in the summer sun while officials took their lunch break. And don't worry about the screaming. The neighbors were used to it. Now imagine you're innocent. Congrats. You're still tortured because they need a clear confession for proper paperwork. Better to admit something than risk being labeled uncooperative. Imperial logic at its finest. So next time you complain about modern bureaucracy, remember, at least the DMV won't beat you with bamboo until you admit you might have parked wrong back in 1372. You might think you're alone, but in Imperial China, someone was always watching. And no, not just grandma or your nosy neighbor. The state's surveillance wasn't digital. It was human, carefully trained, state-approved, and ultra-thorough. It started at the village level, where each town had a local registrar or elder who wasn't just there to hand out rice. key was your friendly neighborhood snitch. Your neighbors were spies. That family definitely spies. Thus, so next time you complain about modern bureaucracy, just remember, at least the DMV won't whip you with bamboo sticks until you admit you might have parked wrong back in 1372. You think you're alone? Nope. In feudal China, someone was always watching. And no, it wasn't just your grandma or your judgmental aunt. State surveillance wasn't digital. It was human, carefully trained, state approved, and super thorough. It started at the village level, where every town had a local registrar or village elder who wasn't just there to hand out rice. He was basically your neighborhood snitch, your neighbor's spy, that family down the street. Definitely spies, your lord's servant who claims to be blind and deaf. Spy for sure. People were encouraged to report suspicious behavior, and suspicious could mean anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a gratitude speech. Even being too quiet could draw attention. What are you hiding? Citizen in the cities. You had a whole network of runners, clerks, and assistant judges, all tasked with investigating crimes, passing messages, and casually spying on your every move. Every dynasty had its own version of this machine, but the goal was the same: keep the peace by peeking through every crack possible. Especially fond of sneaky machine, but the goal stayed the same: keep the peace by peeking through every crack you can find. Especially fond of surveillance were the eunuchs in the royal palace. These castrated courtiers couldn't make babies, but they sure could start a coup. Many ran their own secret police forces, managed spy rings, and whispered in the emperor's ear. Some eunuchs held more power than ministers just by knowing who said what to whom and when. And don't even think about complaining about the system, criticizing the emperor, even indirectly, like saying, "The sun looks a bit tired today," could get you accused of slander. Poets mastered the subtle art of flattery. Others mastered the art of silence. Even worse, the government often posted public lists of executed criminals as a warning, with names and crimes. It was basically ancient Facebook, but with more beheadings. So if you have a rebellious thought, keep it to yourself. If your cousin rebels, you better snitch on him. And if someone smiles a little too brightly when asking your political views, that's your cue to fake a cough and make a run for it. Because in feudal China, walls had ears, trees had ears, neighbors had ears, and probably even your rice bowl did. In feudal China, marriage wasn't about love under cherry blossoms. It was duty, negotiation, and dowries heavy enough to snap your ox cart axle. Love was for poetry, not people. Let's start with the basics. Marriages were always arranged. Parents decided your fate before you even learned to hold chopsticks. If your family had status, they hired a matchmaker, a professional snoop who'd compare horoscopes, family records, and check if the future spouse's ancestors had done anything embarrassing in the last 5 dynasties. If everything matched, congratulations, you were engaged to someone you probably never met. Looks, personality, shared interests irrelevant. Compatibility was measured by birth charts and tax records. For women, marriage wasn't an exciting new chapter. It was a polite kidnapping in formal wear. You left your family forever, changed your name, and moved into your husband's house, where you were expected to serve not only him, but his parents, grandparents, and any cranky uncle living in the parlor. The dowry meant your family had to send money, goods, or land with you. The more, the better. Think of it as ancient China's way of saying thanks for taking her off our hands. In return, the groom's family might give engagement gifts. But don't get too excited. Sometimes it was silk and jewelry. Other times, just a slightly better chicken. Once married, your job was clear, have sons, obey the in-laws, and never argue. The wife was expected to be modest, quiet, and hardworking, the holy trinity of chaos control. If you were too loud, too stubborn, or heaven forbids, infertile, you could legally be replaced by a concubine. By the way, yes, concubines were a thing. Rich men could have many, women one man. One shot at survival. Divorce, rarely granted, was social suicide. The only accepted reasons were the famous 7 faults, including jealousy, illness, or gossiping too much. So if your tea habit annoys your husband enough to legally ditch you, well, congrats. In short, marriage in ancient China wasn't happily ever after, and trying not to get banished for serving cold noodles. So you're thinking of rebelling. Maybe you're fed up with the hard labor, the endless bowing, or the smug judge who taxed your rice and dignity all in one afternoon. A bold move. Unfortunately, in ancient China, rebellion didn't make you a hero. It just made you a very short headline. Concubines. Men could have as many concubines as they wanted, especially if they were rich. Women one man, one shot at survival. Divorce was rare and basically social suicide. The only accepted reasons were the classic 7 faults, including jealousy, illness, or gossiping too much. So if your tea habit annoys your husband enough that he can legally ditch you, well, good for you. In short, marriage in ancient China wasn't about happily ever after. It was about not getting exiled for serving cold noodles. So you're thinking about rebelling. Maybe you're fed up with hard work, constant bowing, or that smug judge who taxed your rice and dignity all in one afternoon. Bold move? Unfortunately, in ancient China, rebellion didn't make you a hero. It just made you a very short-lived headline. Let's imagine you gather a bunch of poor farmers, burn the landlord's tax records, and declare a new, glorious era of justice. The problem: the royal army shows up 3 days later with horses, crossbows, and 0 sense of humor. You see, emperors weren't just officials in fancy yellow hats. They were obsessed with stability. Confucian thought taught that rebellion meant chaos, and chaos meant trouble. So if you rebel, you're not just a criminal, you're a cosmic threat. Yeah, real heavy stuff. Punishments for cosmic threats absolutely brutal. You get arrested, paraded around, tortured, and usually executed in ways designed to kill any creative thought. Public beheadings were popular, as was dismemberment. One emperor was really into slow cuts, a charming little method where they slice you up bit by bit until you're officially paperwork and body parts. And it didn't stop with you. The royal government loved group punishments. Your family, neighbors, even the guy who once lent you a hoe. All fair game. The logic wipe out your entire village, and no one else will be crazy enough to rebel. Efficient, terrifying. Still, rebellions happened, from the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the Tay Sun Wars, the Lotus Uprising every now and then. Desperate folks threw a tantrum. Some caused chaos, sure, but most were crushed brutally. Survivors ended up slaves, silenced, or tossed into public works projects they didn't live long enough to finish. Talking about rebellion was risky, too. Write a bold poem hinting at discontent. Boom, arrested. Confess under bamboo torture. If you're lucky, you get exiled to some cold, rocky, flea-infested province to ponder your life choices. Yeah, rebellion sounds romantic, like in TV dramas and legends, but in reality, you're more likely to be a cautionary tale carved onto a public plaque. Want to change the system? Better just keep your head down, literally. So maybe you think, if I can't be a farmer, maybe I'll ace the exams and live the cushy life as a government official. Cute. Welcome to Imperial court life in feudal China, where there's hot tea, silk robes, and palace floors polished to a divine shine, but also knives tucked behind every back. Let's start with the Forbidden City, that fairyland guarded by the Emperor himself. Inside, everyone's smiling and scheming. Officials, ministers, concubines, everyone's caught in a never-ending polite game of betrayal. The only thing nastier than palace life getting your throat slit, and that happened a lot. If you're an official, every move you make is watched not just by spies, but by rivals ready to pounce on any slip-up, false report, treason, or even mispronouncing the emperor's name while reading. Traitors hesitate before kneeling. At least there's some drama. And let's talk eunuchs, those castrated palace servants who held way too much power. Many started low, climbed fast, and ended up as the gatekeepers to the emperor's inner world. Basically, the grumpy unicorns of court politics. You might find your promotion mysteriously stalled, or your name added to a secret missing list after a suspicious accident. Meanwhile, the imperial harem, not a romantic dream. It's a cutthroat political battlefield. Concubines fight for favor, sabotage rivals, and hope to birth a prince, preferably one who doesn't get poisoned before age 5. Technically, the empress might be in charge, but good luck controlling 30 jealous women with nothing better to do than plot creatively. Even poetry is risky. Use the wrong metaphor about withered flowers or crumbling walls, and people might think you're criticizing the emperor. Some officials got executed just for writing poems about the weather because the emperor got the hint. And when the emperor died, oh boy, that's when the real fun began. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, tragic illnesses. Half the court usually didn't survive the transition, so palace life isn't exactly safer. It's just death wrapped in silk. Your robes might be red, but so is the floor beneath you. And when the emperor croaked, oh boy, that's when the real fun started. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, unfortunate illnesses. Half the court usually didn't survive the transition, so court life wasn't any safer. It was just death wrapped in silk. Your robe might be red, but so was the floor beneath you. You made it this far, bowing, bleeding, memorizing 400 Confucius sayings, and dodging at least 3 types of death. But here's the big truth about life in ancient China. You were just a statistic, a dusty entry in the tax ledger. To the empire, you weren't. A person with hopes and dreams. You were a tiny, nameless grain of rice, easily crushed and ideally harvested for labor or earn income. The state doesn't care if you're ambitious, talented, or have inner beauty. They just want to know if your family paid taxes on time and if you have a strong son ready for the next border defense project. According to the emperor, you're just a speck of dust among hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous speck. You're not a royal golden seal or a holy relic. You're a vital cog in the canal digging, rice growing, silk spinning machine built to keep the dynasty going. Your birth date is recorded not to celebrate, but to tax you later. Your death is noted mainly so your family stops claiming your share, and your life's purpose: don't cause trouble, line up, do your part, and try not to starve during droughts. Individualism. Cute idea, but nope. You don't chase passions. You follow your dad, your master, or whatever bureaucratic rank you've been handed, standing out. That's a threat to the state. Like plague or a Mongol invasion, harmony is everything. Even your feelings must match your social status. Feel sad like a peasant. Fine, feel inspired. Sit down. The census doesn't ask about your favorite poem. It asks if your roof leaks and if you raise pigs. Even your body belongs to the system. When drafted for public works, you might build a canal you'll never benefit from, or guard a wall you'll never see finished. Die on the way. No big deal. There's always more grain where you're headed. In feudal China, you mattered, but only if you were counted, taxed, or quietly buried. So that wraps up 15 chapters. If you noticed, one thing's clear: the Chinese Empire was mighty and brutally ruthless. Sure, this civilization gave the world brilliant inventions like gunpowder, paper, compass, printing, and an actually efficient bureaucracy. The Great Wall, snakes over mountains. The Forbidden City stands like a royal jewel of imperial will, and poetry flows like the mighty Yellow River, beautiful, endless, and often disastrous if misunderstood, an unmatched legacy, reality, harsh, hierarchical, always just one bad rice harvest away from collapse. For every elegant stroke penned by a scholar, 10,000 farmers are stuck in mud, wondering if there'll be grain left after taxes. For every emperor buried under jade and gold mountains, hundreds of workers get buried there too, because inconvenient witnesses must be silenced. Feudal China's glory wasn't cheap. Childhoods lost to endless studying, exhaustion from farming, lives cut short by laws, famine, or military drafts. This system worked great for a tiny elite. The rest they worked till they dropped. And the worst part, most accepted it not because they loved oppression, but because the system convinced them it was nature's law, that heaven chose their emperor, filial piety, obedience, and silence were virtues. Silent suffering was a form of virtue too. That legacy, this clash of glory and misery, still echoes today. When we look back at feudal China, people often see calligraphy, architecture, philosophical quotes carved in stone. They don't always see the concubines poisoned in harems, starving mothers selling combs for rice, or the scholar who failed the exam for the 7th time and vanished. So, you wouldn't survive a day in feudal China, not because you're weak, but because that world wasn't built for survival. It was built for endurance, tradition, and control, yet somehow the empire endured. The people suffered, but only a few of their stories get told. In spring 1846, the Great Westward Migration was in full swing. The Oregon Trail was buzzing with life. Cows lumbered along, wagon wheels creaked, and families dreamed of fresh starts. Among them was a group of about 30, led by brothers George and Jacob Donner, plus businessman James F. Reed. These weren't fortune hunters or explorers. They were farmers, craftsmen, moms, and kids chasing the dream of California's fertile valleys. Timing seemed perfect. No snow for months, and thousands had already blazed the trail. But the Donner Party, which later grew to 87, made a huge mistake that turned their journey into a disaster. They took a shortcut. The so-called shortcut was Hastings Cutoff, an untested route pushed by Lansford Hastings, a total opportunist who hadn't even ridden a wagon on it himself. This shortcut promised to shave weeks off the trip by going through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings sent guides ahead with letters encouraging settlers to follow his new route, trusting those letters. The Donner Party ditched the traditional path. At first, spirits were high. The group included kids, elderly parents, families singing hymns at night, clinging to hope. But trouble came fast. The Wasatch Mountains were way tougher than Hastings claimed. Wagons had to be dismantled, dragged piece by piece, then reassembled so progress slowed to a crawl. Tensions flared, supplies ran low, then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert was a brutal, sparkling hellscape. Hastings said it would take 2 days to cross. Reality 5 times that. Water barrels ran dry. Animals collapsed. Oxen went nuts. Wagons got abandoned in alkali dust. They'd wasted precious time, and winter wasn't far off. Heading back to the main trail cost them weeks. Other wagon trains crossed the Sierra Nevada. The Donner Party, exhausted and behind schedule, pushed on, unaware the worst was yet to come. The dream of California was still alive in their heads. But the mountains didn't care about dreams, and soon hunger would strike. By late October 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada. This was supposed to be the last big obstacle before the promised land of California. But these mountains were not just tall, they were savage, and winter came early. The group broke up. Some families pushed ahead while others, including the Donners and Reeds, lagged behind, slowed by broken wagons, injured oxen, and exhaustion. Snow started falling light at first, then heavy. In just a few days, crossing became impossible. They were trapped. They camped at Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, while others stopped further away at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were built from pine logs and wagon parts. They killed their last animals, Hides were turned into crude shelters. Snow piled up 6 feet, then 10. Hunger came fast. Rations were slashed. Livestock vanished. They boiled strips of raw hide and wore leather belts. One kid tried eating a blanket. Another chewed bark until her gums bled. Each morning brought another cold corpse. Death moved slow, polite, then brutal inside those cabins. There was no warmth, just smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers tried soothing starving kids. Fathers stared out at endless white snow, calculating how far they could walk. Arguments broke out. Hope evaporated like mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the rooftops. Trees snapped under the weight. Any thought of escape was buried under the white silence. The pass was closed, and the dream of California. The ox was injured and exhausted. Snow started falling, lightly at first, then heavier within days. Travel became impossible. They were stuck. They camped at Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, and others stopped further at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were built from pine logs and parts of wagons. They killed the remaining animals. Hides were used to make crude tents. Snow piled up to 6 feet, then 10 feet. Hunger came fast. Rations were cut. Livestock vanished. They boiled strips of rawhide and wore leather belts. A kid tries to eat a blanket. Another chews on tree bark until his gums bleed. Every morning, there's another cold corpse. Death moves slow, polite, then brutal. Inside those cabins, no warmth, just smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers try to comfort starving kids. Fathers stare out at endless white snow, calculating how far they can walk. Arguments break out. Hope vanishes like mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the rooftops. Trees snapped under the weight. All thoughts of escape were buried beneath the silent white. The pass was closed, and the dream of California into the endless white snow, calculating how far they could even walk. Arguments broke out. Hope vanished like mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the rooftops. Trees snapped under the weight. Every thought of escape buried under a silent white blanket. The pass was closed, and the dream of California melted away, replaced by one desperate thought: survival. By mid-December, with no rescue in sight, 15 of the strongest formed what became known as the Forlorn Hope. 10 men and 5 women strapped on makeshift snowshoes and tried to cross the mountains on foot. Carrying sparse rations and an unbearable burden of whatever horrors might come next. Behind them, dozens remained at camp, starving, slowly dying, waiting in a frozen hell. And for those desperate folks, the question wasn't if they'd survive. It was who would die first and who would get eaten. On December 16th, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were called the Desperate Hopefuls, not by the newspapers, but by fellow immigrants stuck in the same nightmare who watched them leave and knew exactly what despair meant. These fellow immigrants, who saw them off knew despair well lost, hopeless, and beyond pessimistic. Each person carried only what they could: bits of dried beef, flint, a rifle, and ragged blankets. They made crude snowshoes, hoping to walk over deep snow. But let's be honest, they barely worked. Those makeshift snowshoes were supposed to help them trek through deep drifts, but mostly just failed. Snow kept falling, and it never stopped. They trudged miles every day, slowing down from exhaustion and the brutal cold of the wilderness above. Within days, they were lost. Food ran out almost immediately. They misjudged the distance. They caught a squirrel, boiled a pine cone, then a man collapsed. Franklin Graves, the oldest guy in the group. His daughters wept as he died in the snow. They couldn't do a thing. And then, one by one, the others started falling. Antonio, the Mexican mule driver, Patrick Dolan, going insane and delirious. Lemuel Murphy, only 13. Death didn't come like a storm, but as a slow, silent creep, quiet, white, and unavoidable. Then came the moment where desperation broke the last boundary and cold logic took over. The survivors began cutting flesh from their fallen comrades. They cried, prayed, vomited, then ate. This wasn't savagery. It was math. Starve or survive. Sarah Graves, just 19 at the time, later recalled her first taste. She never mentioned it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Marianne Graves held her sister's hand and whispered. They didn't have to do anything as long as they made it home. When they staggered out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 were left alive. 5 women, 2 men, their eyes sunken, cheeks frozen, mouths sealed shut. But they carried something way stronger than supplies or maps. They carried the news. Dozens were still trapped at Donner Lake, starving, freezing, waiting, and in desperate need of help. Right now, California, which had barely cared about the Donner tragedy before, suddenly woke up. The horror was too big, the shame too heavy. Rescue teams were organized, but when they arrived, the snow was even deeper, and inside the lakeside cabins, what they found was beyond imagination. The first rescue team reached Donner Lake in February 1847, 2 months after the hopes that emerged from the mountain in autumn. What they found wasn't a camp. It was a graveyard, the cabins half buried in snow, doors tightly shut. Inside, people sat motionless, too weak to stand, eyes glazed over from hunger. Children lay beside their dead parents, frozen corpses piled like firewood, and a stench so foul, unforgettable, reminding everyone what happens when the meat runs out. Some tried to talk, others just stared. Of the 87 who started the journey, nearly half had died, and the ones still breathing were barely human anymore. Gaunt skeletons wrapped in filthy skin whispered prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescue team brought supplies: flour, dried meat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to haul dozens of wagons through snow deeper than the horses. They had to make impossible choices. Kids went first, the smallest, lightest, with the best, shot at surviving the mountain trip down. Parents stayed behind. Nearly half were dead, and those still breathing barely looked human. Gaunt skeletons wrapped in filthy skin whispered prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescue team brought supplies: flour, jerky, blankets, but not nearly enough to save everyone. There was no way to haul dozens of wagons over snowbanks taller than the wagons themselves. They had to make impossible decisions. Kids were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest, the ones with the best shot at surviving the trip down the mountain. Parents stayed behind, silently watching strangers take their children away, not knowing if they'd ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions went out. Each one battled blizzards, avalanches, and terrain that swallowed the entire Donner Party. With each return, the rescuers brought back fewer supplies and found fewer survivors. Silently watched strangers take their children away, not knowing if they'd ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions went out. Each battled blizzards, avalanches, and terrain that swallowed the entire Donner Party. With each return, rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors. And darker stories. Truths started to leak out, not just about starvation, but about cannibalism, about how, on the worst nights, when all hope was lost, some survivors ate the dead. Some even whispered that people killed others to survive. Names were kept secret, but rumors ran wilder than facts. Some got judged, others beaten, most just James Reed, kicked out at the start for killing a man in self-defense, came back as a rescuer against all odds. He found his wife and kids still alive, but George Donner was dying at Alder Creek, his arm rotting away. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave his side. She stayed when everyone else left and never came back. When the last survivors finally hit California in April 1847, the nightmare was over. But the emotional, cultural, and historical scars were just starting to form. News of the Donner ordeal spread east like wildfire, each retelling getting darker, messier, and more horrifying. The press couldn't get enough. America, caught up in its manifest destiny fever, suddenly stared at its own shadow. The story was too juicy to ignore. Pioneers chasing paradise turned into snowbound cannibals. Headlines called it the Sierra Cannibal Horror. Others accused survivors of murder. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a national reckoning. Western expansion had always been glorious, sacred, inevitable. Now it was stained with images of starving settlers roasting human meat over pine firewood. Reporters obsessed over every gruesome detail. Who ate who died fast, who lingered too long. Sarah Graves, one survivor, was arrested for questioning. Same with Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family. Survivors were caught between fame and shame, praised for surviving, but judged for how they did it. James Reed, once a disgraced exile, returned to San Jose, a changed man haunted but vindicated. His leadership during rescue missions earned public sympathy. and he spent most of his later life trying to protect the survivors' reputations. But even he couldn't silence the whispers. Tamsin Donner became a tragic icon, a devoted wife who stayed with her dying husband, repeatedly refusing rescue. When she finally tried to leave with a group of men, she never made it. Her fate is murky. Some say she died of cold. Others claim she was killed and eaten by the very men she trusted. The government said almost nothing. California was on the brink of becoming a U.S. territory, and the last thing officials wanted was to tarnish the Western dream. The whole mess was brushed aside as a tragic fluke. No investigations, no official inquiries. But in every barbershop and tavern, people whispered about the survivors. The name itself became a cautionary tale. Kids were warned, don't take shortcuts, don't get lost, or you'll end up like them. But behind the horror, something deeper lingered. Questions about survival, morality, and how fragile civilization really is when the snow just won't stop falling. For those who survived the Sierra nightmare, the journey didn't end when the snow melted. Survival came at a cost, etched deep into their bones and memories. The survivors escaped the mountain, but never really left it behind. Many were kids. They came back to civilization as walking ghosts, quiet, starving, wide-eyed. Some, like 13-year-old Virginia Reed, lived a long time. She eventually married, had kids, and even published letters about her pain. But beneath her calm exterior was a sharp pain, like an old wound that never healed, never really left it behind. Many were children. They returned to civilization as walking ghosts, quiet, starving, wide-eyed. Some, like 13-year-old Virginia Reed, lived long enough. She eventually married, had kids, and even published letters recounting her pain. But beneath her calm exterior was a pain that stabbed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, after losing her whole family, married young, their children, and even published letters recounting their pain. But beneath her calm exterior was a pain that stabbed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, who lost her whole family, married young, and died just a few years later. Louis Kesselberg, a German immigrant among the last rescued, was haunted forever by rumors that he didn't just eat the dead, but also killed to do it. He sued a newspaper for libel and was only awarded $1. Didn't matter. That stain never faded on him. Some survivors tried to disappear. They changed their names, moved far from California, or refused to talk about what happened. Others couldn't stop talking. They were haunted not just by what they did, but by what they saw others do. Not just the cannibalism. It was the slow, creeping decay of humanity, watching friends shrivel into skeletons, hearing the silent cries of mothers, too weak to feed their kids, choosing who to save when there was never enough room for everyone. The community reacted in all sorts of ways. Some treated survivors with pity and respect, recognizing their suffering as heroic endurance. Others whispered and gossiped, desperate to steer clear of what had become a living nightmare etched into the American frontier legend. Thanks to his deeds, James Reed rebuilt his reputation. He fought in the Mexican-American War, made it big in San Jose, and lived to a ripe old age. But even he admitted in letters that the images of the dead, the sounds of the camp, never left him. Not a single survivor of the Donner Party came back unchanged. Whether 8 or 80, they all stared into the desperate void and made choices most of us pray will never face. And in the silence between starvation and horror, they left behind a truth few want to admit. Survival isn't always clean. It's not always noble. Sometimes it's just about living with what you've become. The Sierra Nevada mountains never forgot those who gave everything. The lake, where so many waited out the blizzards, where they died, starved, and were fed, now called Donner Lake. Saked postcard of natural beauty with a name that hums uneasily. Over time, the landscape became part of the legend. Tourists visit the spot where cabins once stood, hike the snowy trails where fragile hope once stumbled, and gaze at mountains that refused passage to pioneers. Locals tell stories. Some whisper that the place is cursed, that the trees remember, that the wind carries voices. In 1918, a granite monument was erected near the lake. At its peak, a solemn pioneer family father, mother, and child faces west, forever hopeful. The base stands 7.7 meters high, marking the snow level of that brutal winter. It's a monument to endurance, tragedy, and the fragile line between civilization and survival. But even carved in stone, the story is uneasy. The monument says nothing about cannibalism. The silent despair, betrayal, or the burned bodies sacrificed to keep others alive. It's a sanitized memory, a comfort made for the public, not the brutal truth. Every year, students visit the site. They hear the basic version: pioneers stuck, survived, maybe mention starvation, rarely the rest. Celebrating resilience is easier than staring down the cost of survival. Still, the mountains. Remember, the paths they walked are still there, buried under ski resorts and hiking trails, where Tams and Donna stayed with her dying husband is now a picnic area. The frozen cabin where kids wept, silently replaced by plaques. But the air stays heavy, as if the ground still holds memories of shoes crunching in snow, of mothers clutching dead children, strangers sharing meat with trembling hands and averted eyes. Nature doesn't care. It never apologizes. But the story remains, not just because it's horrifying, but because it's deeply human. The Donner Party isn't just about failure or cannibalism. It's about how far people will go to protect family, cling to hope, choose life even in its ugliest form, and in the stillness of the mountains. That choice still echoes in the decades that followed. The story of the Donner Party, developed, twisted by memory, distorted by gossip, and reshaped by the demands of a drama-addicted nation. The truth was harsh enough, but that didn't stop storytellers from making it worse, or, in some cases, turning survivors into heroes. Some survivors got romanticized, painted as tragic pioneers who stared down hell and came back scarred. Others, like Louis Kazerberg, morphed into villains in the public imagination. He was accused of hoarding food, killing Tams and Donna, and enjoying the grim necessities of survival. None of these charges were proven, but the truth, in the age of cheap novels and printing presses, was never top priority. The public craved extremes. They didn't want nuance. They wanted martyrs or monsters, which made life after surviving pretty rough. Every interview, every sketch, every fictional retelling reopened old wounds. Some survivors tried to set the record straight. Virginia Reed published her own story years later. She begged future pioneers to avoid shortcuts and listen to those with experience. Others stayed silent, worn out by the burden of memory and the world's fascination with them. By the late 19th century, the Donner Party had become part of folklore. Campfire stories whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale taught to school kids, a metaphor for bad planning, pride, and what happens when you trust terrible advice. The CFF Hastings Group became infamous, synonymous with deadly shortcuts, and over time, the real horror of the story cannibalism was used to cover up a deeper tragedy, that the whole ordeal could have been prevented, that bad leadership, empty promises, and systemic inexperience killed more people than the snow ever did. Yet there's something very American about how this story lives on. It's not just a tale of failure. It's about obsession, momentum, about reinvention, with the illusion of conquering nature and fate. The Donner Party is a mirror, reflecting not just despair, but the shattering of the myth of Western perfection under its own weight. The truth is, there were no heroes, no villains, just people making impossible choices. And as the snow melts and time passes, that question never really fades. What would you do today? The Donner Party isn't just a footnote in American history. It's a twisted, debated, and deeply uncomfortable icon, unlike other pioneer bravery stories. This one refuses to sit neatly in the noble westward expansion gallery. It's still raw. We remember the cannibalism, sure, but that's just the final act. The real legacy lies in everything that led up to it. Illusions of shortcuts, the deadly power of poor leadership, faith in maps drawn by dreamers instead of realists. The Donner Party exposed the fragility of the American dream when faced with nature's brutal indifference. But in that collapse, we also find something else: resilience. The survivors didn't just leave the mountains. They rebuilt, married, had kids. Some stayed in California. Others moved away to escape the whispers. Some quietly thrived. Their lives were defined not by what they did to survive, but by choosing to keep living afterward. But the cost of that survival is eternal. The Donner Lake area remains preserved and somber. Visitors walk among pine trees and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak softly. Historians argue over details. Writers can't ignore the story because the Donner Party poses questions history often dodges. What happens when every choice left is one you swore you'd never make? That existence is eternal. The Donner Lake area remains preserved and gloomy. Visitors walk through rows of pines and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak quietly. Historians argue over details. Writers can't let go of the story because the Donner Party asks questions history usually ducks. What happens when every option left is one you promise never to choose? What happens when your dream of paradise turns into a snowy grave, and if survival is all that's left? Does how you survive even matter? No satisfying answers, just echoes and bones buried under the snow. In the end, the Donner Party reminds us that human strength isn't measured by glory, but by resolve, not by conquest, but by the brutal, awful choice to keep breathing, even when all comfort, laws, and illusions of civilization have been brutal. Horrific choice to keep breathing, even when all comfort, law, and illusions of civilization were stripped away. So we remember them not just for what they did, but for what they endured, not as legends or cautionary tales, but as humans full of fear, grit, flaws, and humanity. And in the Sierra winds, their story still whispers through the trees, forever frozen in time, forever unfinished. Wu Jiao wasn't born into royalty. She was born into something far more dangerous, ambition wrapped in silk. It was the year 624 AD, and the Tang dynasty was still young, shining with promises and poetry. Her father was a timber merchant, rich enough to give his daughters rare perks, tutors, books, and the radical idea that a girl's wit could be as sharp as any guy's sword from a young age. Wu Jiao stood out, while her peers learned embroidery and how to pour tea with humility. Wu was busy with politics, history, and literature. She was hooked on strategy and tales of feudal dynasties. She didn't just read about powerful men, she imagined herself as one of them. By age 14, her beauty, brains, and education caught the eye of the Tang Emperor himself. She was summoned to the palace to become one of the emperor's many concubines. At first glance, that sounds like a dead end. After all, she ranked pretty low, just a talented young lady among dozens. But Wu had zero intention of fading into oblivion, even in a palace dripping with silk and whispers. She stood out. She memorized the emperor's routines, his likes, his moods. She mastered the art of silence, knowing when to speak up and when to vanish behind the curtain. But, most importantly, she watched. She watched how power was wielded, and more crucially, how it slipped away. And when the Tang Emperor fell ill, Wu Jiao didn't panic. She had a plan. After he died, she was supposed to be sent off to a Buddhist convent. Her life was basically over. But fate, or rather, Wu's cunning had other ideas. She caught the eye of the emperor's son, Li Qi, the future emperor Gaozong of Tang, and he hadn't forgotten her. What happened next kicked off a chain of silent revolutions. Wu was no longer just a concubine. She was a student of power, and soon its master. The girl who once hid behind palace screens would become the woman ruling from the dragon throne, but her rise was just starting. and the empire wasn't ready for what was about to unfold. When Emperor Taizong of Tang died in 649 AD, court protocol spelled out Wu Jiao's next step with chilling clarity. She would be sent to a convent to live out her days, shaved bald and silent. Most concubines before her accepted this fate, quietly, not Wu Jiao, before Taizong's death. She had already started a delicate, dangerous relationship with his son. Li Qi, the new Emperor Gaozong, was it true love or ruthless calculation? Their bond survived the power transition, and then, less than a year after entering the convent, Wu Jiao returned not as a discarded widow, but as the secret empress, queen, and Gao Zu's wife. The Empress Wu orchestrated her comeback with a dash of irony, hoping to distract the emperor from another favored concubine. She invited Wu Jiao back to the palace. She might as well have handed her the keys to the empire. Wu took on her new role with a cold charm. She bore the emperor's sons a trump card no rival could match. But she didn't just give him heirs. She gave him ideas. Soon, she became the emperor's closest advisor, whispering thoughts that slowly reshaped national policy and court rituals. Some said the emperor was in love. Others whispered he was bewitched. Either way, she was indispensable now. Then came the family drama, rivalry with the empress and another favored concubine, Consort Xiao, escalated into a quiet war. In 654 AD, tragedy struck or was staged. Wu Jiao's newborn daughter died suspiciously. She accused Empress Wang of murder. What happened next was swift and brutal. Wang and her ally, Consort Shen, were deposed, imprisoned, and eventually had their hands and feet chopped off. Empress Wang's hands were severed and her tongue cut out. They say her final screams sounded like a pig being butchered. Wu Jiao was now quick and brutal. Wang and Shi were deposed, imprisoned, and finally had their limbs chopped off. Empress Wang's hands and feet were cut off, and her tongue was cut out. They say her last screams sounded like a pig being slaughtered. Wu Qiao now officially became empress. This wasn't just a rise to power, it was a coup dressed up as destiny. Wu Jiao went from concubine to empress, not with armies, but through alliances, assassinations, and slowly chipping away at her enemy's influence. She didn't just survive the palace. She tamed it on her terms, but she wasn't done yet, not even close. She got a taste of power. Now, she wanted the throne itself, not just beside the emperor, but above him. And for the first time in China's long, patriarchal history, that wild dream started to look real by the late 660s. Wu Jiao was no longer just a concubine whispering advice behind a folding screen. She'd become the silent puppet master of the empire. Emperor Gaozu's health began to fail. His eyesight dimmed, and his strength drained in his weakness. Wu Jiao saw her chance. She stepped up as his proxy, issuing edicts in his name, running court meetings, even reviewing imperial inscriptions reserved only for the emperor's eyes. Everyone knew what was going on, but dared not speak up. China was now ruled by a woman at first. Wu Jiao ruled cautiously. She backed Buddhism over traditional Confucianism, using Buddhist teachings to justify her political presence. After all, if the Buddha once appeared as a woman, why couldn't a woman lead the empire that was spiritual logic mixing with raw political power? She restructured the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit instead of family ties. That was revolutionary in a court dominated by aristocrats. To supporters, she was a reformer. To enemies, she was a social arsonist, burning centuries of tradition to ashes. Still, Wu Jiao stayed patient. She never rushed to claim the throne. Instead, she waited, eliminated rivals, gathered allies, and mastered political language. She sowed information like seeds throughout the bureaucracy. She used royal spies like pruning shears. Any official who opposed her got demoted, exiled, or executed, while she outwardly remained loyal to the emperor. In 683, Emperor Gaozong died. Nature's order demanded men reclaim power. His son, Zhongxun, took the throne, but when he showed independence, appointing his in-laws to key positions, Wu Jiao struck back. She demoted him and installed another son, Rui Song, who was easier to control, behind the throne. She ruled absolutely as Empress Dowager and Regent, the perfect cover for power, a mother protecting the empire in her son's name. But soon, even that fiction of male rule began to grate. Why hide it anymore, grumbled the top ministers. Court scribes whispered. They warned that China had never had a female emperor. It was unnatural. Wu Jiao listened. Then she quietly began prepping a new name, a new dynasty, and a new chapter in history, where the emperor wore a phoenix crown, not a dragon. She wasn't keen on ruling in the shadows anymore. She was ready to grab the spotlight. In 690, Wu Jiao finally pulled back the curtain. No more proxies, no more sons on the throne with her hand. Behind the scenes, she declared the Tang dynasty over and birthed a new regime, the Wu dynasty, named after one of ancient China's golden ages. Carefully chosen to evoke legitimacy and virtue. No longer Empress Dowager Wu, she was Emperor Wu Jiao, China's first and only female emperor. The court was stunned. Some scholars recoiled in outrage, quoting Confucian texts that said women must be obedient, humble, and locked away in inner chambers. But Wu Jiao rewrote the rules. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, promoted commoners indebted to her, and crushed dissent before it took root. To cement power, she leaned heavily on Buddhism. Temples popped up all over the empire. She was seen as the reincarnation of Matra, the future Buddha. One monk even found a scripture claiming that one day a woman would rule the world and bring peace to all humanity. Lucky us. That woman was on the throne. She had portraits painted of herself, sitting on the throne with calm authority, and carved inscriptions in stone, praising her as a divine ruler in a patriarchal society. That was basically heresy, but it worked like a charm. Wu Jiao ruled with a blend of iron and silk. She strengthened the examination system, making sure that officials were picked for skill, not family ties. She reformed agriculture, lightened the peasants' load, and boosted state revenue. Under her reign, the empire mostly stayed stable and thriving, but her power came with a price. She ran a secret police network, sniffing out dissent like incense smoke in a temple. Court conspiracies kept growing. Critics disappeared. Rumors of executions, forced suicides, and torture spread like dark incense behind palace walls. Still, she ruled with iron dignity. Draped in her dragon robe, she met the emperor, issued decrees in her own name. For 15 years, Wu Zetian wasn't just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person. She climbed ladders no one said she could touch. And now, she stood alone at the peak, ruling China as the only empress. Gave her prestige, but it also made her the center of every grudge, fear, and bruised ego in the empire. She rewrote tradition, defied chaotic order, and outmaneuvered generations of nobles. And that meant something. Everyone in silks watched her, waiting. The court buzzed with a silent rebellion. The big shots bowed by day but plotted by candlelight. Not even her own kids were safe. The sons she treated like pawns started hating her iron grip. They craved power. But Wu Zetian taught them exactly how dangerous ambition could get. She believed none of them would survive. Wu Zetian wasn't just ruling. She was playing a non-stop psychological chess game. Suspected conspirators got booted on flimsy charges. Trials were quick, confessions often forced, executions public. Her enemies called her bloodthirsty, but really, she was surgical. This wasn't madness. It was method. She created new bureaucratic ranks, titles that sounded grand but held little real power. That's how she rewarded loyalty without giving up control. She also raised women's status at court, putting trusted female relatives and concubines into roles previous generations couldn't even dream of. Yet, over time, her dependence on a few key players started to tarnish her legacy. The most favored duo, the Zhang brothers, rose from palace entertainers to political heavyweights, handsome, charming, and decades younger. They quickly won hearts and influence. To her critics, it was embarrassing. The once sharp and ruthless empress was now seen as a lonely woman clutching youth amid a pack of sycophants. Rumors of corruption and decay began to spread, but those whispers couldn't erase her achievements. Under her rule, literacy expanded, civil exams got reformed, and state infrastructure improved. She didn't just rule, she ruled effectively. Still, her health started to fail. Her grip remained firm but was weakening. Behind her, vultures circled, eager for normalcy to return, hoping the throne would be manned again. Wu Zetian knew the end was near. The only question, would it be illness or betrayal? By the early 700s, Wu Zetian was in her 70s, old for anyone, let alone an emperor. Her body weakened, energy drained, but her mind stayed sharp. Ever alert to palace politics, she still ruled, But now from a reclined chair behind golden screens, out of sight, while those closest to her started circling like wolves, sensing weakness. Her trust in the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Changzong, became a source of mockery and resentment, ruling effectively, but her health started to fail. Her grip on power was strong, but slipping, and behind her, vultures circled, eager for the old normal, craving a man back on the throne. Wu Jiuan knew the end was near. The only question was whether it'd be illness or betrayal. By the early 700s, Wu Jiao was in her 70s, ancient for anyone, let alone an emperor. Her body weakened, stamina fading, but her mind was sharp, always watching the palace politics like a hawk. She still ruled, but now from a reclining chair behind golden screens, out of sight, while those closest to her circled like wolves, smelling weakness. Her trust in the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Changzong, became a source of ridicule and resentment. Once favorites, now seen as corrupt puppeteers, twisting imperial decisions for their own gain. Ministers had long accepted their presence and started scheming. In 705 CE, the palace finally fell. A group of senior officials and generals staged a swift coup. It wasn't bloody. No need for that. The empress was surrounded, her allies arrested, and the Zhang brothers executed on the spot. No questions asked. Their heads put on display like some gruesome, "Hey, don't mess with us" message. The phoenix's wings were clipped before the pressure crushed her and her health took a nosedive. Wu Zetian had no choice but to step down. She was forced to abdicate and hand the throne over to her son, Zhang Zong, the same son she had deposed earlier for having a mind of his own. She retreated into retirement. Her once sprawling court shrank to a tiny entourage, but even in abdication, she kept the emperor title and kept pulling strings behind closed doors. China might have changed the name on the throne, but the shadow of Wu's reign lingered in every policy, every law, every official trembling at the thought of another woman with ideas. She died by the year's end. No grand tomb, no fancy epitaph. Her name quietly erased from the official history books. The Tang dynasty wiped her image out as thoroughly as possible, like her reign was a nightmare they wished to forget. But history, and Wu Zetian herself, are hard to silence. Decades later, poets and scholars still debated her. Was she a genius or a tyrant, a monster or a savior? One thing's clear: she broke every rule the empire threw at her, and for 15 years, she didn't just challenge history, she became history. After her death in 705, the Tang quickly moved to erase Wu Zetian's unprecedented dynasty. Official history got rewritten. Her reforms were credited to male successors, her name scratched off records, and temples replaced by safer, more familiar male names. Yet, despite the state's efforts, Wu Zetian refused to vanish. People still remembered her. Scholars couldn't ignore her. Foreign envoys still talked about the empress who ruled the greatest empire on earth. And in a weird twist, The very scholars and historians tasked with downplaying her legacy ended up preserving it. You can erase a name, but you can't erase a dynasty that shaped a generation. Her achievements are undeniable. She elevated Buddhism to a new level, turning it into the empire's legitimacy backbone. She restructured the bureaucracy, made civil exams more merit-based, and cut back on aristocratic nepotism. She defended the empire's borders, launched successful military campaigns, and crushed most internal rebellions, a feat most male rulers could only dream of. And for women, Wu Zetian's reign was a brief, dazzling star in the dark sky of submission. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and opened doors to unprecedented power access. Her rule became legendary precedent, proving women could not only survive palace intrigues, but also rule the country. Still, her legacy remains controversial. Later Confucian historians painted her as a monster in disguise, a dangerous woman who seduced power and bathed the court in blood. Tales of her cruelty were exaggerated, her lovers multiplied, and her ruthlessness reached near demonic levels. It was easier to villainize her than admit she outperformed many of her male predecessors. But modern historians have started to rethink today. Wu's launching successful military campaigns and quashing most internal rebellions, feats most male rulers could only dream of. For women, Wu Zhao's reign was just a brief, bright star in the dark sky of submission. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and opened doors to unprecedented power. Her rule became legendary proof that a woman could not only survive the palace, but also dominate the country. Yet, her legacy remains controversial. Later, Confucian historians painted her as a monstrous femme fatale, a dangerous woman who seduced her way to power and drenched the court in blood. Stories of her cruelty were exaggerated, the number of her lovers inflated, her ruthlessness almost demonic. It was easier to make her the villain than admit she outshone many male predecessors. But modern historians have started to rethink today. Wu Zhao is recognized not just as a powerful woman, but as one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history. Male or female, her reign, complex and contradictory, is a masterclass in statecraft, political survival, and mind games. She ruled at a time when women were told to shut up. She conquered a system built to crush her, and in the ashes of her era, her name still blazed brightly, quiet, strong, and mind control. She ruled at a time when women were told to keep quiet. She conquered a system built to crush her, and in the ashes of her era, her name still blazes bright, quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. To understand Wu Zhao's reign is to understand the China she shaped, not just through decrees and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. Her rule wasn't just a political oddity, it was a civilization's turning point. First, she redefined what it meant to be an emperor meant. Traditional emperors surrounded themselves with Confucian scholars and warlords. Wu Jiao flipped the script, building her court around Buddhist monks, scholars from humble origins, and loyal officials who owed their careers to her talent-spotting vision. This fundamentally reshaped power structures of the Tang dynasty. Under Wu Jiao, the civil service exams got tougher and more inclusive. This empowered scholars from poor, non-noble families, a huge break from the aristocratic monopoly that had ruled since the Han dynasty. By doing this, she laid the foundation for a more dynamic, skilled bureaucracy that lasted long after she was gone. Culturally, she sparked a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture, temples, shrines, and huge monuments bearing her name and image sprang up at Longmen Caves. A gigantic Vairocana Buddha statue has features identical to Wu, majestic, calm, all-knowing. These weren't just religious offerings, they were political monuments. Every structure sent the same radical message: a woman could embody cosmic order. She also changed the language of power. Wu Jiao introduced dozens of new Chinese characters, officially some to express abstract virtues, others specially crafted to glorify her rule. Most of these characters vanished after her dynasty, but the boldness of inventing a new script to describe a new regime says a lot about her vision. Perhaps her most revolutionary move was reshaping gender roles, presenting herself as both mother and ruler. She blended intimacy and empire. She didn't directly challenge masculinity. She absorbed it into her persona. She was both protector and nurturer, and ruthless enforcer of the law, dragon and phoenix, emperor and empress. Her empire wasn't perfect. Decline was punished harshly. Trust was a rare currency, but it worked, grew, and expanded under her leadership. And that's undeniable despite centuries of opposition to her legacy. Wu Jiao didn't just rule the Tang dynasty, she remade it. She died over 2,300 years ago, but echoes of her reign still resonate in Chinese cultural memory, a haunting tune of brilliance, brutality, and bold defiance. Though her name was once chiseled out of stone and erased from official annals, time has its ways of digging up what history tried to bury. In the centuries that followed, she became a paradox in folklore. She's portrayed with every trait imaginable, from ruthless seductress to ruling deity. Opera troupes dramatized her life, sometimes as a tragic heroine, other times as a cruel tyrant. She was called a demon, hailed as a saint, misunderstood, but never forgotten. No woman in Chinese history can match her for climbing or wearing the crown. Others held power as empress dowagers or regents, but no one dared call themselves emperor. Nobody dared remake a dynasty, rewrite the language, or stand alone on the world's most powerful throne like she did. And the legacy of breaking this untouchable rule still sparks heated debates. To some, she's a cautionary tale, the danger of unchecked ambition, of femininity in armor. But to others, especially modern historians, feminists, and political thinkers, she's something entirely different, a symbol of resilience, a case study in political genius, a monument to the price you pay and the chaos you unleash when you lead without a clue. To this day, Gokyu isn't just a historical footnote. She's a whole mirror. In her rise, you see the cogs of systemic injustice grinding away, and in her reign, the moment they get jammed, she didn't just defy expectations, she wiped them off the map. But greatness has its toll. Her legacy is still clouded by moral gray zones. She wielded fear as much as fairness. Her enemies didn't just die disgraced. Sometimes they didn't even get a trial, their voices, lost to history's dustbin. Her compassion was selective, her justice strategic, not a saint. But she never tried to be one. Gokyu chose survival over popularity and surviving. She made history, and she's still hanging around. The Empress rising from the shadows of concubine life, stepping into a world that said no, and answering with a throne in the land of dragons. She crowned herself a phoenix, and in those flames, she etched her name into eternity in the ancient world. Roads weren't just for getting around. They were power plays. The moment a ruler ordered a path cut through forest, desert, or mountain, it wasn't about convenience. It was about control. Roads were the empire on the move. Unlike rivers or oceans decided by nature, roads were man-made. They sliced through geography, linking distant outposts to the capital and reminding everyone merchants, rebels, you name it, that civilization had leveled up. A good road meant armies could march fast, taxes got collected, and goods from the border flowed straight to the empire's heart. The earliest known roads popped up in Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. Not your modern paved highways, but tightly packed dirt paths for carts and caravans. Even back then, society grasped a key truth when people move. Ideas, goods, and influence moved too, and whoever built the road controlled the flow. In ancient Persia, the royal road stretched over 1,000 miles from Sardis to Susa. It featured way stations, rest stops, and a royal courier team that could gallop across the empire in record time. Herodotus claimed a message could travel the entire length in just 7 days. That speed wasn't just impressive, it was downright scary. It meant the king's voice could echo through every corner of the empire in days, not weeks. But the Romans, they were the real roadmasters. They built over 50,000 miles of stone-paved roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Straight, durable, and engineered like a boss. These roads weren't about beauty. They were all about efficiency. Legions on the march, grain shipments, imperial messengers, all depended on the stone underfoot. Roman roads were mostly military tools, but their impact on civilians was just as revolutionary. Farmers could get their goods to market. Travelers got safe passage. Cities connected not just politically, but by stone and sweat. In every major civilization, roads were never just transportation. They were transformation, because building a road meant reshaping the land and reshaping who ruled that land. If the ancient world had a tech superpower, it was Rome. And their greatest tool wasn't aqueducts or arches, it was the road, Roman roads, not just paths, but the empire's backbone. The saying, all roads lead to Rome, isn't a metaphor, it's logistics. The Romans built over 50,000 miles of paved roads, complete drainage systems, and straight as an arrow routes. They connected Britain to Egypt, the Rhine to the Danube, and every strategic military outpost in between. These roads made the empire feel smaller, faster, and easier to manage. Roman engineers followed in the middle. These roads made the empire seem smaller, faster, and easier to manage. Roman engineers had a formula. First, they picked a route not necessarily the easiest one, but usually the straightest. Then, they surveyed by. Tools like the groma were used to nail down right angles and distances. Once the road was mapped out, they got to work digging. A Roman road was built in layers, kind of like a conquest cake. The bottom layer, big ol' stones. On top of that was the rudis, a mix of crushed rock and lime. Then came the nucleus, a tightly packed layer of sand or gravel. Finally, the summum dorsum, the top, paved with stone slabs linked together, usually sloped in the middle to drain water. The result, a road that could handle weather, horse hooves, and sandal stomps for centuries. Some are still in use today, but the engineering is only half the story. Roman roads had infrastructure, milestones, rest stops, and stations called mansio, where officials and messengers could rest and resupply. The cursus publicus, Rome's express delivery system, used these roads to shuttle messages across the empire at jaw-dropping speeds, sometimes nearly 50 miles a day. And these roads moved more than just men. They moved masses. Revolt in Gaul. A skirmish in Judea. The Roman army could march hundreds of miles faster than any enemy expected. Roads were an extension of Rome's military muscle, silent, solid, and always pushing forward. But with soldiers came settlers, and with settlers came cities. Roads fueled trade, migration, and spread Roman law, language, and architecture. They were cultural arteries as much as conquest tools. For Rome, roads weren't a luxury. They were a necessity, a symbol, a message carved in stone that said Rome is here, and wherever Rome built, the world beneath their feet changed. While Romans built stone roads, the Inca Empire built theirs in the sky, spanning over 25,000 miles. Capac Ñan, the Inca's grand road system, was an Andean engineering marvel. It connected some of the most challenging landscapes on Earth, linking deserts, jungles, and mountains over 13,000 feet high. And the Incas did it all without wheels, draft animals besides the humble llama, or metal tools as Europeans would know them. This wasn't just a road system, it was the backbone of an empire. At the center was Cusco, the Inca capital, shining like spokes in the sun. These roads linked provincial centers, military outposts, farming hubs, and sacred sites. The most famous stretch, the Inca Trail, winding its way to Machu Picchu, but that's just a thread in a massive imperial web. Roads varied in size and structure. In lowlands, they were wide and paved with stone. Up in the mountains, narrow paths carved into cliffs, sometimes barely a foot wide, where rivers flowed. The Incas built suspension bridges from braided grass ropes, strong enough to hold travelers and llama caravans. These bridges had to be rebuilt every year, a community ritual still alive. In parts of Peru today, no wheeled carts here. All travel was on foot or llama back, but the Incas had a faster way chasqui relay runners. These messengers sprinted between rest stops or stations spaced a few miles apart. Messages, food, even fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor in Cusco in just days. This system let the empire run at insane speed despite having no written language. But the roads had spiritual meaning too. Many followed main sacred paths stretching from Cusco to temples and mountains. Travel wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Every step reinforced imperial order and religious harmony. Capac Ñan wasn't a Roman-style conquest machine. It was a lifeline, a way to keep an empire standing strong from snow-capped peaks to coastal deserts. The roads created unity, though most are gone now. Some sections survive. Stones fitted without mortar still bear footprints after 500 years. The Incas didn't just conquer the Andes, they stitched them together, one path at a time, centuries before Rome, and far from the Andean heights. Another empire tied its vast lands together with stone and strategy. The Achaemenid Persian Empire built a grand road system, and at its heart was the Royal Road, a 1,500 kilometers engineering marvel, stretching from Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, all the way to Susa, one of the Persian capitals, commissioned by King Darius the Great in the 5th century BC. The Royal Road wasn't just a fancy trade route. This was a political highway, a flex of imperial sophistication, and one of the first really long roads ever documented. The Persians didn't invent roads, but they standardized them, militarized them, and turned them into the backbone of their bureaucracy. Their engineers surveyed routes that balanced terrain with straight lines, dodging swamps and hills when necessary. The result, surprisingly smooth, speedy connections across a continent-spanning empire. Herodotus bragged that royal messengers could blaze the entire royal road in 7 days, a trip that would normally take an average traveler about 90 days. How relay stations, every 15 to 18 miles, there was a station with fresh horses and supplies. Messengers swapped horses and sprinted on at full speed. A system basically the Pony Express on steroids, $2,000 years before. It was cool. But this road wasn't just for messengers. Merchants, military units, diplomats, and tax collectors all regularly used it. The Royal Road helped create a multicultural empire of Greeks, Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Babylonians, and many others. It pulled off something pretty wild for the ancient world: centralized oversight of far-flung provinces. Road guards kept things safe, and caravans provided shelter and food. The whole system depended on maintenance and order, 2 things the Persian bureaucracy nailed, Road repair crews fixed damage and sometimes charged tolls at river crossings or mountain passes. The Persians also pioneered road markers and milestones distance tools that kept consistency across regions. These customs got recycled later by Rome and Byzantium. The royal road didn't survive intact after Persia's fall, but its legacy did. Alexander the Great used it to invade the empire. The Romans then expanded on the idea. Even today, some highways still follow these ancient routes. It proves a solid point: empires aren't ruled just by swords. They're shaped by the speed of their messages and the power of their roads. While the Romans were busy laying stone roads in Europe, and the Incas were carving trails through the Andes, another empire was quietly building a road network that would shape the world. In a different way, Han China, their roads didn't just connect cities, they built a civilization and fueled one of history's most legendary trade systems, the Silk Road under the Han, especially during Emperor Wu's reign from 141 to 87 BC. Roads became tools for expansion and control. The government threw resources into building and maintaining routes, stretching from the capital Chang'an all the way to Central Asia. These roads weren't just for merchants, they were crucial military and administrative highways. Unlike Roman stone roads, Han roads weren't uniformly paved. Many were just hard-packed earth or gravel, sometimes reinforced with wood planks in marshy areas or stone slabs in highlands. But what they lacked in technical uniformity, they made up for in scale and organization. Their postal relay system, called Yichuan, grew impressively. Stations were spaced evenly, with fresh horses and lodging for government messengers. This let imperial decrees and tax records travel thousands of miles at astonishing speed. These roads supported not just governance, but diplomacy and trade. Messengers like Zhang Qian, who ventured west into Central Asia, opened connections with far-flung cultures like Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flooded out. In return, China got horses, glassware, and new agricultural ideas. Security was key. The Han invested heavily in military outposts along. Technically, they kept things unified by scale and organization. Their postal relay system, called Yichuan, got a serious upgrade. Stations popped up at regular intervals, stocked with fresh horses and lodging for government couriers. This let royal edicts and tax records travel thousands of miles at lightning speed. These roads weren't just about administration, they also boosted diplomacy and trade. Couriers like Zhang Qian, who ventured west into Central Asia, sparked connections with far-off cultures like Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flooded out. In return, China got horses, glassware, and fresh farming ideas. Security was key. The Han dynasty invested heavily in maintaining military outposts along these routes, especially near the Gansu corridor, a windy, narrow strip acting as the gateway between China and the West. Watchtowers, signal mounds, and walled settlements dotted the road, lighting up the empire's presence like a string of lanterns. Culturally, the road system spread Confucianism, Buddhism, and administrative practices far and wide. Travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants spread ideas alongside goods, forming a unified identity that lasted long after the Han era. Han roads weren't built to impress, they were built to endure, while many cities vanished beneath newer ones or got swallowed by dust and desert. Their legacy stuck around because through these roads, China didn't just defend its borders, it opened a door to the world. The ancient Greeks rarely get credit for their roads. They didn't build grand highways like the Romans or stretch out vast traffic networks like the Persians. But what they did build, though smaller in scale, shows how roads can shape not just trade and war, but culture, religion, and identity. The rugged, mountainous terrain of Greece made road building tough and pricey. So, instead of royal highways, the Greeks developed a network of local stone-paved routes, usually connecting city-states rather than uniting a sprawling empire. These roads followed natural land contours and were often narrow, just wide enough for pack animals or chariots. Still, simple as they were, they played a crucial role in Greek life. One famous route was the Sacred Road, from Athens to Eleusis, used in the Eleusinian Mysteries rituals, a religious festival dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Every year, thousands of initiates marched this road in a grand procession, chanting and carrying offerings. For them, the road wasn't just a path, it was a rite of passage, a journey from the world of the living to the mystical and transformative. Another iconic route was the Pan-Hellenic Road leading to Delphi, home of Apollo, pilgrims, kings, and philosophers all took this winding road through mountains and valleys seeking oracles. Along the way were treasures, temples, and inscribed stones crafting, a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. But Greek roads weren't just sacred, they were walked by soldiers, philosophers, and merchants alike. Think Xenophon's Anabasis, describing the grueling retreat of Greek mercenaries through Persia, a brutal long-distance trek, or picture Socrates strolling from the agora to the academy or lyceum to teach under the open sky, his feet tracing the paths of dialogue and debate. What set Greek roads apart wasn't their engineering. It was how they blended into everyday life. They weren't emperor-built monuments to power, they just appeared, and their integration into daily life. These weren't imperial projects to showcase dominance. They emerged naturally, shaped by markets, sacred sites, and social rituals, and through them, ideas spread faster than soldiers or chariots. Philosophy, theater, democracy, even Olympic athletes, all traveled along dusty, narrow, winding roads through olive groves and city gates. Simple, yes, but these Greek roads carried the weight of a civilization that changed the world not by force, but by ideas. In ancient India, roads were more than just channels. They were the lifeblood of spiritual life, empire control, and cultural exchange. From the Maurya Empire in the 3rd century BCE onward, under Gupta rule later, Indian civilization developed a tightly organized network of roads connecting fertile river valleys, seaports, trading towns, and sacred cities. The biggest road makeover happened under Emperor Ashoka, the Buddhist king who ruled most of the subcontinent around 268-232 BCE. After ditching violence following a bloody war with King Kalinga, Ashoka switched to public welfare, and roads became the centerpiece of that transformation. He ordered roads to be built and expanded across his empire, not just dirt paths either. These were carefully planned routes, often shaded by trees, with wells and inns for travelers. He put stone pillars carved with inscriptions along the way, not to mark distances, but to issue edicts preaching compassion, honesty, and religious tolerance. This was governance via visibility. The most famous road stretched from Pataliputra, now Patna, to the northwest border, linking the Ganges Plains with modern Pakistan and Afghanistan. This stretch later became part of the northern trade route, which evolved into the Silk Road, connecting India with China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world. Indian roads didn't just carry goods, they carried faith and philosophy. Buddhist monks traveled these paths to spread their teachings. Hindu pilgrims used them to move between sacred rivers and temples. Even great philosophers sought quiet contemplation on these routes. Roads became bridges between ideas. Trade boomed. From the East Coast, goods like spices, textiles, ivory, and gems moved inland and out, reaching Roman ports and Central Asian markets. Roads connected urban hubs like Taxila, Ujjain, and Varanasi, each a center of commerce and learning. Although many Indian roads weren't paved like Rome's, they were seasonally maintained, especially before monsoon season. Engineers used gravel, wooden planks, and packed earth, often raised slightly to prevent flooding. What made ancient India's road system unique wasn't brute strength, it was diversity. Roads served kings, farmers, saints, and scholars alike. They connected empires and worldviews, and in this mix of politics, spirituality, and economics, India didn't just build roads, it opened routes to influence far beyond its borders. Ancient roads weren't just flat stretches on the ground, they were engineering marvels that crossed rivers, mountain passes, and tough terrain. To build efficient roads, civilizations had to master the art of bridge building, drainage, and durable construction. The Romans pioneered bridge engineering. Their roads often crossed big rivers on stone arch bridges, structures that could hold heavy loads and last centuries. Bridges like Ponte Milvio in Rome and Alcantara in Spain are classic examples. Roman arches used keystone stones and carefully cut blocks, perfectly distributing weight. Their bridges weren't just practical, they symbolized imperial power, inspiring awe and respect. But the Romans weren't the only ones. The Incas, facing raging rivers slicing through the Andes canyons, built suspension bridges from grass ropes and vines woven together. These bridges were light, but incredibly strong, rebuilt annually by local communities through ceremonies still practiced today. Crossing these bridges, incredibly sturdy, rebuilt annually by local communities according to rituals still practiced today. Crossing these bridges wasn't just a physical challenge, but a cultural one, binding the community to the land and to each other. In ancient China, engineers came up with beam bridges and floating bridges. The famous Anji Bridge was built during the Sui dynasty, finished in 605 AD, and it's the oldest open segment stone arch bridge in the world. This bridge was a slick combo of beauty and impressive engineering, letting a ton of traffic cross the Jing River for centuries. The drainage system, equally crucial, Roman roads were crowned in the middle to shed rainwater fast, with ditches on both sides. In the soggy, monsoon-prone lands of India and Southeast Asia, roads were often raised on embankments or layered with gravel to dodge erosion. Some empires went all out, building roads with multiple layers, soil, stone, gravel, and tightly packed slabs to guarantee durability. Beyond bridges and drainage, roadside toll stations and milestones gave travelers places to rest, resupply, and find their way. Basically, the OG highway pit stops. These engineering feats didn't just make travel easier, they shaped economies, wars, and culture. One bridge could mean the difference between an army rolling into enemy territory or getting stopped cold. A well-kept road meant a city's survival hinged on trade and communication. Ultimately, ancient road building was a showcase of human skill, a testament to how societies adapted and reshaped their environments to move people, goods, and ideas across vast lands. Throughout history, old roads weren't just paths. They were the secret sauce for empires to grow, expand, and last. Roads connected far-flung cities and remote villages, fueling trade, communication, and cultural exchange, shaping civilization itself. Empires knew that without efficient roads, armies couldn't move fast, governors couldn't enforce laws, and merchants couldn't thrive. Roads created economic hubs, boosted urban growth, and even influenced the spread of religions and philosophies. The Silk Road, Rome's Via Appia, the Incas' Chapacñan carried way more than just goods. They carried ideas and identity. Maintaining these roads took massive bureaucracies and dedicated labor forces, showing off the organizational power of empires like Rome, Persia, China, and the Incas. Roads became the ultimate measure of an empire's reach and stability. When roads were well maintained, empires thrived. Neglect them, and regions fell into isolation, rebellion, or decay. But roads also symbolized human ambition, the urge to connect, control, and communicate over vast spaces. They showed early engineers and leaders understood geography wasn't just a barrier, but a foundation to reshape. Today, many ancient roads lie buried beneath modern highways, while others remain archaeological treasures. They remind us that infrastructure we take for granted was once a massive achievement, built with sweat, stone, wood, and skill. The legacy of ancient roads lives on in every journey we take, every letter sent, and every trade route connecting our globalized world. They're the silent architects of empire, culture, and civilization. At its core, the story of ancient roads is the story of humanity itself, always on the move, building bridges literally and metaphorically across time and space